The booth was already waiting. The woman behind the counter already knew the order. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was Tuesday after church, or the Saturday the whole family came through. The place where something good was always ready. 20 restaurants, scattered across the country, each one somebody's second kitchen. Today, every one of them is gone. Section 1. Wells Supper Club. The set ended somewhere close to 3 in the morning, and if you were in Harlem in the 1940s and had just finished 2 hours of the thing you were best at, you had a problem that no ordinary meal could solve. Dinner was behind you. Breakfast was somewhere on the other side of sleep that had not happened yet. You were the particular kind of hungry that only happens after real work, and the streets outside the Cotton Club or the Apollo or the Savoy were still alive with the energy of a neighborhood that had not decided to stop. What you needed was a plate of something real at an hour when real food was hard to find, and if you knew where to go, you turned toward 2247 7th Avenue, between 132nd and 133rd Streets, where a light was still on, and something in a pan was making the sound of the correct temperature. The restaurant started in 1938 with 3 booths and 5 stools. Joseph T. Wells and his wife Ann opened it with whatever they could manage, and for the first 2 years it was simply one of many small eating spots in a neighborhood that had always had more of them than most. What changed was who came in. Harlem in that era was the center of American jazz in a way no American city has been before or since, and the musicians who worked there worked late, and they were hungry when they finished, and Wells was open. Billie Holiday came. Duke Ellington came. Nat King Cole came often enough that when he married, he brought his wedding party to Wells for the reception. By the time the decade was at full speed, the 3 booths and 5 stools had expanded and expanded again until the restaurant held 250 seats, and people stood outside waiting for them. The dish that made Wells famous was not planned. It came out of the particular problem of that hour, a gap in the day when dinner was over and breakfast had not started, and the musicians arriving between midnight and 4 in the morning needed something that worked as either meal or neither. The chicken from dinner service was still available. The waffle batter was ready for morning. What Joseph Wells began doing was putting them together on a single plate, fried chicken alongside a waffle, and serving that to the people who came in from their gigs. And those people ate it and came back and brought others. A practical solution to a specific problem of timing became the thing Wells was known for across 6 decades, and eventually across the country, because a man from Harlem named Herb Hudson carried that combination with him when he moved to Los Angeles in 1975 and opened Roscoe's House of Chicken and Waffles. And in accounts given over the decades, he cited Wells as the place where the idea first formed in his mind. The combination itself had older roots than the restaurant. Chicken over waffles with gravy had existed in Pennsylvania Dutch cooking for generations before Wells opened. What Wells produced was different, a southern fried version, the chicken seasoned all the way through and crusted dark, sitting next to a waffle that was sweet rather than savory. The contrast between them, the whole argument for the plate. Once you had eaten it at that hour, in that room still warm from the musicians who had been there an hour before you, you understood why the place held 250 people and still had people standing on the sidewalk outside. If you came in with someone who mattered in that Harlem, you sat and the room moved around you without interruption, because that was simply what the room at Wells did. The musicians who played the famous venues came because Wells was open when nothing else was, and because the food was real. The neighborhood regulars came because the food was always the same and always right. Both groups sat in the same booths and received the same plate, and nobody had to explain the arrangement because the arrangement explained itself. You were hungry and the food was ready. That was the whole transaction at Wells for 61 years, and it was enough. The neighborhood changed around Wells in ways that had nothing to do with what was coming out of the kitchen. By the 1980s, Harlem was going through the long, difficult stretch that most people who lived there remember without much nostalgia, and Wells went through a period of reduced hours and uncertain future along with everything else on the block. It came back, but not all the way, and in 1999, the restaurant that started with 3 booths and 5 stools served its last plate and closed for good. The building stayed. The corner kept moving. What Wells had done in its time was give the neighborhood something to come home to at any hour, and give American food a combination that now appears on menus in cities Wells never reached, and in restaurants whose owners may not know where it came from. The particular meaning of a corner changes when the light that made it a destination goes out. The corner of 132nd Street and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard is still there. What it no longer has is a window lit at 3 in the morning with something inside worth walking toward. Wells closed in 1999, and Harlem kept going without it. But the next place on this list opened in a different city, 7 years earlier, and what it held was not a combination that traveled but something older, something that fed an entire movement before it fed anyone else. and that a city eventually tore down to put a parking lot where the booth had been. Section 2. Alex Barbecue Heaven. The ribs were the reason. That was the argument people made for years, the argument that eventually attached itself to one of the most consequential speeches in American history, because the man who wrote those speeches had a specific relationship to slow-cooked pork and smoke that his associates understood as a working condition rather than an indulgence. Andrew Young, who stood at Martin Luther King Jr.'s side through the years when Atlanta was the center of everything important happening in American civil rights, described the process decades later. King would get the ribs from Alex, or have somebody bring them, and then you could not stop eating them. And if you could not stop eating, you could not go to sleep. And when you could not go to sleep and had something to say, you read and you wrote. And by morning there was a speech. The ribs at Alex Barbecue Heaven were probably as responsible as anything for King's greatest speeches, Young said. You can decide how much credit belongs to the smoked pork and how much to the man holding the pen. What is not disputed is that King had a booth at Alex and came back to it so often that everyone understood it as his, and that after April 1968 the booth had his name on it and nobody sat in it. Ernest Alexander opened the restaurant in 1942 on West Hunter Street in Atlanta, which has since been renamed Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, a renaming that captures something true about what that block was. The West Hunter Street Baptist Church was half a block away, where Reverend Ralph Abernathy preached, where the movement was organized for years, which meant the people planning the most important political work in the country were regularly walking past a barbecue restaurant with a sign that said Heaven. Many of them went in. Alexander kept the place open whenever they needed it. His daughter Pamela said later that if leaders came by when the restaurant was closed, her father would come down and open it for them. That was not a business policy. That was a decision a man made about what his building was for. The food was not complicated, which was the whole point. Smoked meats, and the sauce Alexander named himself. He called it comeback sauce, and when his daughter asked him why, he told her, because if they taste it, they will come back for more. The name turned out to be accurate. The sauce was what people talked about when they talked about Alex, the way certain preparations become synonymous with specific addresses and cannot be fully separated from the physical place where they were made. You could describe it as a barbecue sauce and be both correct and entirely missing the point. Alexander ran multiple restaurants over the years, eventually 6 at various points in Atlanta, but Alex was the one that held its particular place in the life of the movement and the neighborhood. The proximity to Abernathy's church made it a natural gathering point. The food made it something people came back to deliberately rather than by convenience. And the distinction between those two reasons is the difference between a restaurant that lasts a year and one that lasts 50. When King was assassinated in Memphis in April 1968, the booth in the back right corner of Alex became a memorial. The people who worked in that movement and in that city understood what the booth meant. A corner seat in a small barbecue restaurant became the marker for an absence that the neighborhood felt in ways that resist easy description. The object held significance not because of what it was made of, but because of who had occupied it and what they had been planning while they sat there. After the assassination, a shrine went up around the booth. The restaurant continued. The booth stayed. What Alex did not survive was a decision made by the city of Atlanta in the early 1990s. The land was acquired through eminent domain to make way for a grocery store. A Publix was built. The Publix eventually became a Walmart. The address that had fed King and Abernathy and Young and the people who organized the strategy that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is now a Walmart parking lot on what is now Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. There is no sign on the pavement, no marker on the building, no acknowledgement of what stood there before the city decided the land had a better use. Pamela Alexander has said in interviews that you can see the exact spot from the street, just shrubs and baskets now, the last visible remnant of an address that once held the most important dinner table in Atlanta. She still sells the comeback sauce. She kept the recipe and the name and the story her father told her about why he chose that word. The sauce survived. The booth did not. The kitchen did not. The smoke that rose from West Hunter Street for 50 years did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A parking lot covers what Alex left behind, and the city kept building over it. But the next restaurant on this list opened in a different city a few years later, and it built something that no city ever tore down. It simply ran out of the people who had always filled it, and closed on a Sunday in January, and a whole neighborhood felt the silence the following week. Section 3. Army and Lou's the tablecloth was red linen, and it had been laundered and pressed and set the same way before every service for 65 years. That was the first thing you noticed when you walked through the door at 422 East 75th Street on the south side of Chicago, because a tablecloth like that in a room like this meant something specific to anyone who understood what the South Side was and what it had always asked of the people who built businesses inside it. It meant the person who opened this place understood what the neighborhood needed beyond food. It meant someone had decided that the people sitting at these tables deserved the full version, the good setting, the room that told you before you ordered that the occasion had been taken seriously. Army and Lou's opened in 1945, which made it the oldest black-owned restaurant in the Midwest by most accounts, and it built the kind of reputation that takes longer than any advertisement to create. The reputation of a room where the food is always right and the table is always ready. The smothered fried chicken was what people cited first when they described the food, a preparation that required time and patience, and the particular knowledge of when to pull the lid and when to leave it alone. The chitterlings were there for the people who had grown up eating them and wanted them done correctly. Baby back ribs, Creole shrimp, mixed greens with smoked ham hock, a menu that ran the whole length of what serious black Southern cooking could do when it had 65 years to practice. On Friday and Saturday evenings, the restaurant had live jazz. This was not a promotional decision. It was a statement about what kind of place Army and Lou's intended to be and had always intended to be, which was the kind of place where a South Side family could bring their children on a special occasion and have the complete experience, music and linen and food made from scratch in a kitchen that knew what it was doing. Former co-owner Goldie McDuffie described it later as the first place where many middle-class African-American families took their children to a restaurant with tablecloths and napkins, with real service and live music, the version of dining out that the white establishments of that era were not offering to anyone who looked like them. That was the gap Army and Lou's filled, and it filled it with enough consistency that 65 years of families passed through the same door and sat in the same booths and ate the same chicken. The list of people who came to 75th Street over those decades covered the full range of what Black Chicago meant in its prime. Martin Luther King Jr. visited in the 1960s when he came to the city organizing. Cab Calloway ate there, Muhammad Ali, Smokey Robinson, James Brown, the politician Charles Percy. Reverend Jesse Jackson was a regular, and it was not unusual to see him eating alongside his son, or alongside Representative Danny Davis, at a table that needed no reservation, because the staff already knew who they were. The rapper Common has talked about eating there. When Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor, died in office on November 25, 1987, reporters came to Army and Lou's to find the people who had known him, because everyone understood that his table was there. The booth where Washington sat still had his name on it when the restaurant closed. That is the measure of what a regular means at a place that takes its regulars seriously. Not a plaque on the outside wall, but a name inside the room where he sat. The closing came on a Sunday, January 30th, 2011. The co-owners had been fighting the economic reality for long enough that it was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching, but a surprise is not what matters when something like this ends. What matters is the silence in the following week when the corner is still there and the door does not open. Chicago had lost more than 17% of its black population in the decade before the closing. The people moving out of the South Side neighborhoods that Army and Lou's had served since 1945, the customer base dispersing to suburbs and to other cities, the next generation not returning the way the generation before it had. What closes a restaurant that old is not usually a single failure. It is the slow withdrawal of the people who made it necessary. Former owner Harry Fleming said afterward that when you lose your base, when the foundation scatters, the next generation is not there to keep it going. He called it the loss of a real strong sense of heritage, and he was not wrong, but heritage requires proximity to sustain itself, and the proximity had been shifting for a decade before the linen came off the tables for the last time. The building at 422 East 75th Street is still on the south side. The red linen is not there. The jazz is not there. Harold Washington's booth is not there in any way that means anything now. What remains is the record of a room that told everyone who walked into it, for 65 years, that they were worth the full version of what a restaurant could be. Army and Lou's closed the same year Chicago stopped being the kind of city that could hold it. But the next restaurant on this list was smaller and older and operated by a single woman in a neighborhood that needed her more than she needed a review, and it ran for 70 years before the building simply ran out of the person who had always made it work. Section 4. Isola's Wednesday morning was the only time the door was locked. Every other morning of every other week for more than 70 years, the lights at 522 East 79th Street came on before the rest of the block had decided to be awake, and the kitchen started doing what the kitchen always did. And if you needed a meal at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, or at 6 in the morning on a Sunday, or at any other hour the ordinary world had written off as too early or too late, you could walk through that door and sit down and be fed. The restaurant closed on Wednesday mornings not for any reason related to the business or the neighborhood, but because that was when they cleaned, and a kitchen that fed people around the clock needed at least one honest window of maintenance every week. That was the only concession Isola White ever made to the idea that a restaurant needed to stop. She opened the place in 1940, which made it the fourth black-owned business to open on 79th Street in Chicago's Chatham neighborhood, and she ran it for 7 decades in the particular way that a person runs something they built from the ground up and cannot imagine existing without. The food was soul food in the full sense. Ham hocks and black-eyed peas, fried chicken, catfish, the kind of menu that does not require explanation to anyone who grew up eating it, and requires very little explanation to anyone who didn't. What made Isola's different from every other restaurant on that block, or on most blocks in Chicago, was not the menu but the hours and the woman behind them. You could get a meal at any point in the day. The only question was whether you were hungry enough to come through the door. When Isola White opened that restaurant, she was doing something that very few black women in Chicago in 1940 were doing, which was owning and operating a business in a neighborhood that needed anchors and did not have enough of them. A funeral director who knew her for decades said afterward that she was probably one of the first black female restaurant owners in the city, and that being a woman and being black and opening a restaurant in that era was already 3 things that worked against you before you considered anything else. She considered nothing else. She opened and she stayed open, and she taught the people who worked for her how to cook. That last part mattered in a specific way. White had a practice throughout her years in business of hiring people who could not find work elsewhere, people who had been turned away from other jobs for reasons that had more to do with other people's decisions than with their own abilities, and she brought them into her kitchen and she taught them, not as a policy or a program, as the simple extension of a belief that if you had a kitchen and someone was hungry for work and hungry for a meal, the right thing to do was provide both. A retired police officer who became her legal guardian in her final years said she hired the less fortunate among them, taught them to cook and to ring up sales and to keep a restaurant functioning. That description covers the mechanism but not the meaning. What she was doing was making the restaurant a place that existed inside the neighborhood's needs rather than alongside them. The room held a round table where you had to be someone specific to sit. Mayor Harold Washington sat there. Count Basie sat there. The Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright August Wilson sat there. Judges and politicians and police officers who covered the walls in photographs came through the door the way people come through doors of places that have decided to take everyone seriously, which is to say regularly and without ceremony. The wall of photographs of Chicago police officers was not decoration. It was evidence. It told anyone who walked in that this kitchen had been feeding this city for decades, across administrations and neighborhood shifts and every other change that can happen to a block over 70 years. What ended Isola's was not gentrification and not a rent increase and not a fire and not a business failure in any ordinary sense. It was dementia. Isola White was diagnosed and could no longer run the operation and left management in the hands of people who were not equal to it, her words in a later interview, and by 2011 the restaurant was closed. A retired police officer named Dwayne Mason tried for years to save it, organized fundraisers, explored every option available to him. None of it was enough. White spent her final years in a nursing home, without the building that had organized her life since 1940. People who knew her said she was heartbroken after the closing, that the dementia spread quickly once the restaurant was gone, that the restaurant and the woman had been so thoroughly the same thing for so long that separating them accelerated what the illness was going to do anyway. She died in April 2018 at 96 years old. The last meal at 522 East 79th Street had been served 7 years earlier. For more than 7 decades, the light was on. The door was open every day but Wednesday morning. Anyone who walked through it could sit down and be fed. That was simply how the kitchen worked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Isola's ran on the same corner for 70 years and closed because the woman who ran it could no longer stand in it. The next restaurant on this list ran for 44 years on the other side of the city, and it closed for the same reason, except the woman who built it had been feeding a movement first and a neighborhood second, and knew exactly who was sitting at her tables. Section 5. Edna's Restaurant. The biscuits were why people crossed the city. That is not a figure of speech. People who had moved from the west side to suburbs and to other cities made specific return trips to 3175 West Madison for the biscuits that came out of Edna Stewart's kitchen, the hot buttered kind, that arrive at the table in a basket and create an obligation you did not anticipate when you sat down. They were what made Edna's exist in 2 registers at once, as a neighborhood institution for the people who could walk there, and as a destination for the people who once could walk there and now had to plan around it. Both groups sat in the same room and received the same basket, and nobody had to explain the arrangement because the arrangement had been explaining itself since 1966. Edna Stewart opened on the west side of Chicago that year, first inside a bowling alley and dance hall at a location that guaranteed customers before the kitchen had fully organized itself. The bowling alley brought them in the door. The fried chicken and the biscuits kept them. She had learned to cook from her mother, a Tennessee-born woman who had carried a tradition of home cooking to Chicago when the family moved north from Covington in 1936, part of the same Great Migration that had been filling the west side with southern families for 2 decades by the time Edna was born. What came out of that kitchen was not a restaurant's version of something, it was the thing itself. The recipes that had made the trip north intact and were being tended in a Chicago kitchen the same way they had always been tended in Tennessee. What happened early in the restaurant's history could not have been planned. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago. He came specifically to organize on the west side, and organizing on the west side put him half a block from a woman who believed without complication that feeding people doing the right thing was as simple as cooking what you knew. Civil rights workers came to Edna's when they had no money. She fed them. No policy, no announcement, no program. She simply opened her kitchen to people who needed a meal, the same way she opened it to everyone else, which was completely and without condition. Jesse Jackson and his associates were in the restaurant so regularly through those years that the address became defined by who chose to sit in it. When King came through Chicago and needed somewhere to eat and somewhere to think, Edna Stewart's kitchen on West Madison was where he went. Then, April 1968, King was shot in Memphis and the west side burned. What happened in Chicago in the days after the assassination was the worst civil disorder the city had seen in the 20th century, and Madison Street was at the center of it. Businesses on both sides of the block were destroyed. The neighborhood that had organized itself around those addresses spent years recovering from what 4 days of fire took away. Edna's was not destroyed. It was not touched. The kitchen at 3175 West Madison stayed intact while the corridor around it was being remade by grief and fire, and Edna Stewart kept it open for 44 years after that night. She outlasted the riots and the economic contractions and the population losses and every other pressure that was closing similar restaurants across the south side and the west side throughout that era, because a kitchen that had survived 1968 had already demonstrated what it was made of. She ran it the way a person runs something understood as a responsibility rather than merely a business. The biscuits were made every day from the same recipe. The fried chicken was her mother's. The collard greens were made without pork in later years because the neighborhood's health consciousness had shifted, and she shifted with it, which is what a cook does when she understands that her first obligation is to the people she is feeding, rather than to the dish. The menu was not precious, the cooking was. Governor Pat Quinn of Illinois declared February 19th Edna Stewart Day the year before she died, the kind of official recognition that tends to arrive just before it is too late, and arrive anyway because the record needs to contain it. She had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She died in June 2010 at 72, and what she had built on West Madison could not survive without her. Her produce supplier, Henry Henderson, bought the business and reopened it within a month under a new name, saying in interviews that he came in every morning and told her they were there, that her spirit was still in the room, that the biscuits were the same and the greens were the same, and the chicken was the same, because there was no honest version of continuing her kitchen that looked any different from what she had made. That version ran for a time and then it closed, the way things close when the person who understood them completely is gone, and everyone else is doing their best from the outside. The biscuits that people cross the city for are not being made on West Madison anymore. The building is there. The kitchen is dark. Edna's closed when the woman who ran it died, and the west side lost the kitchen that had kept it together. But the next place on this list closed a decade earlier, in a different part of the same city. And what it had spent 50 years feeding was not just a neighborhood, but every musician who knew exactly where to go when the stage lights went out. Section 6. Gladys's Luncheonette. The banana pie was the thing people mentioned last and thought about longest. Not the biscuits, though the biscuits had a reputation that preceded the room and earned every word said about them. And not the smothered chicken, though the smothered chicken was the kind of preparation that requires years of the same pan and the same hand to arrive at something consistent. The banana pie at Gladys's Luncheonette in Bronzeville occupied a specific position in the memory of anyone who had sat at that counter, which was the position of the thing you told someone about when you were trying to explain why the address mattered. You had eaten banana pudding before. You had not eaten this one, made in this kitchen, served in this particular room on South Indiana Avenue, and when you finally did, you understood that you had been missing a specific thing without knowing exactly what it was. Gladys Holcomb opened on State Street in the 1940s and moved the restaurant to 4527 South Indiana Avenue in Bronzeville in 1963, settling into the neighborhood that had been the center of Black Chicago life since the Great Migration filled it with families from the South and built the cultural infrastructure that made it one of the most important Black communities in the country. Bronzeville in its prime was a neighborhood that sustained a full economy inside itself, its own newspapers and insurance companies and music venues and political organizations, and a luncheonette in that context was not simply a place to eat. It was part of the connective tissue of the block, the room where the people who ran the neighborhood's life sat down between obligations and ate what Gladys Holcomb had been cooking since the 1940s. What drew musicians specifically was partly proximity and partly the particular truth that a room run by someone who understands hospitality completely becomes a room that people with demanding work seek out, because the relief of being somewhere that requires nothing from you except that you sit and eat is exactly what you need after 2 hours of giving everything you have to an audience. Aretha Franklin came to Gladys's when she was in Chicago. Red Fox came. Lou Rawls came. Della Reese. Negro League baseball players, whose schedules put them in Bronzeville during the seasons that mattered, made it a regular stop. Martin Luther King Jr. came when his organizing brought him to the South Side. Jesse Jackson came with enough regularity that his presence stopped being notable and started being expected. Governor Jim Thompson of Illinois came to the kind of place a governor comes to when he wants to be understood as connected to something real, which Gladys's was, unmistakably. The food that held all of those people at the same counter was built around fundamentals executed without variation. The smothered pork chops were what the Illinois General Assembly resolution, passed after Holcomb died in 2003, called specifically by name alongside the smothered chicken, the fried chicken, the peach cobbler, the biscuits that dissolved in the mouth in the way biscuits dissolve when someone has been making them from the same recipe in the same kitchen for 50 years. The resolution was read into the official record of the legislature and named the luminaries who had eaten at Gladys's the way you name people whose presence confers something permanent on an address. The list ran from King to Rawls to Franklin to Fox to Thompson, which is its own kind of argument about what a luncheonette on South Indiana could hold when it committed entirely to doing one thing correctly for 5 decades. Holcomb ran the restaurant until failing health forced her to step back in 1996. She had been behind that counter, or behind the door to that kitchen, for the better part of half a century, and the particular mathematics of what that means becomes clear only when you try to count the meals. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, across 50 years at a counter that seated enough people to fill and empty several times a day. She died in 2003 without seeing what happened to the building. The restaurant had already been closed for years by then, the address sitting on South Indiana in the way abandoned storefronts sit, still holding the outline of what they were while the neighborhood moved around them. In 2012, a demolition crew came to 4527 South Indiana and took the building down. No replacement luncheonette, no preservation effort, no marker. The lot stood vacant and then was built upon, the way lots in cities are built upon when the people who understood what stood there before are gone or scattered or simply not asked. What the Illinois General Assembly understood when it passed that resolution was that Gladys Holcomb had run something the state was not going to produce again. The language in the resolution did not attempt to describe the biscuits or the smothered chicken in terms that would survive translation into formal legislative language. It simply named the people who had been there and named the food they had eaten and put it into the permanent record before the building came down and made the whole thing past tense. That is what official recognition does for a place that was never going to make it into any other kind of archive. It writes the address into a document that cannot be demolished. The banana pie is not being made on South Indiana anymore. The biscuits are not there. The counter where Aretha Franklin and Red Fox and Martin Luther King Jr. all sat at different times and ate the same food is gone, and the building that held it is gone, and the block has no memory of any of it that did not travel with a person when they left. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gladys's luncheonette was demolished 12 years after it closed, and the block kept going without it. But the next restaurant on this list closed in the same year the demolition crew came, on the other side of Chicago, and what it had spent 60 years doing was feeding the people that nobody else was feeding, at hours that nobody else was keeping. Section 7, Soul Queen. The photographs were the first thing you saw when you walked in, which meant before you picked up a plate or found a table, you already knew who had been eating in this room. Chicago police officers covered one wall, portrait after portrait, years of them accumulating in the particular way photographs accumulate when someone has been making the same choice long enough that the choice becomes its own kind of declaration. The wall was not decoration in any ornamental sense. It was evidence. It recorded the relationship between the woman who ran this kitchen and the people she had decided to stand behind. The same way the investments she made quietly in black-owned banks and in the Ebony and Jet magazines published by Johnson Publishing Company recorded a different version of the same decision made through different means. Helen C. Maybelle Anglin, who grew up in Alabama and came north and opened her first restaurant with 3 stools in the late 1940s, understood from the beginning that a kitchen was not only a place to make food. She built the South Side institution she called Soul Queen around that understanding for 6 decades, and it showed in the walls. She started with an H&H Cafe at 125 East 51st Street, 3 stools at a counter that she eventually expanded to 7 and then to 10, plus a booth, the incremental math of a business that is working and needs more room to keep working. By 1971, she had opened what she formerly called Soul Queen at 22nd Street and Michigan Avenue, and by 1975, she had moved it to 9031 South Stony Island Avenue, which is where it stayed and where it became what the South Side understood it to be, which was the full version of what the neighborhood needed from a restaurant. The name was not false modesty in reverse. The name was a statement of position. She held court there the way the name suggested, at the front of the room, in the particular way a woman holds court who has earned the right to it through decades of labor nobody saw and food everybody ate. The buffet was how the food worked on most days. You moved along the line with a plate and you took what you wanted of the fried chicken, the short ribs, the fresh greens, the sweet potato pie that closed the meal in the way a dessert closes a meal when someone has made it correctly. The pricing was structured to make the meal accessible in the way that a neighborhood restaurant survives long enough to become an institution, which is by deciding that the neighborhood's ability to pay matters more than the margin on any individual plate. Anglin had been feeding people since the 1940s, and she understood the arithmetic of a community better than she understood the arithmetic of a spreadsheet. And the arithmetic of a community said that a restaurant stays open by being the place people can come back to, rather than the place people can afford to come to once. The people who came were not only the people who lived nearby, though those people came consistently enough to fill and refill the room through the decades. Joe Louis had eaten at her table, Muhammad Ali came, Count Basie came, Mahalia Jackson came, and the combination of her presence and the gospel of the food in that room produced a quality of occasion that the South Side understood as its own. A Chicago funeral director who had known Anglin for years described the restaurant as the kind of place where everybody was privy to everybody else's conversations and contributed back and forth, and Anglin was the referee. That description is specific enough to carry the image: a room with low walls between tables, food that requires no ceremony to eat, a proprietor moving through it all who knew which conversation needed redirecting and which one needed space. What Anglin had supported through those decades extended well beyond the walls. Civil rights marchers in the movement years could get a meal at her place. She donated food to local soup kitchens throughout her time in business. The investments in black-owned banks and publications were not made as gestures but as positions. The same kind of decision she made every time she chose to hire someone the rest of the city had passed over and bring them into her kitchen and teach them what she knew. She did not announce these things. They were simply part of how the restaurant operated and what it meant to be inside it. In July 2008, the Chicago Department of Health closed Soul Queen for code violations serious enough to require immediate action: raw sewage coming up through a floor drain, food stored above safe temperatures, an overflowing dumpster, no certified food manager on duty. The restaurant was cleared to reopen 6 weeks later after corrections were made. The closure was the second such action in 10 years, and the regulars who came back after the reopening came back because 60 years of fried chicken and short ribs on South Stony Island is not undone by a health inspection, and because they knew Anglin and knew the kitchen and knew the difference between a problem that gets fixed and a place that stops being worth returning to. Anglin died on September 8, 2009, from multiple organ failure at 80 years old. Her daughter said afterward that Soul Queen was her legacy, and that was how she wanted to be remembered, and that the restaurant would be buried with her because the license was non-transferable and the business could not be separated from the person who had run it since the stools numbered 3. The building on South Stony Island was eventually sold. The photographs came down, the wall of photographs is gone, and the buffet line is gone, and the woman who kept the room together is gone, and the South Side kept going without all 3. But the next restaurant on this list never had a wall of photographs because it never needed one. What held it together was a sauce with a name its founder chose himself, and a booth in the back corner where the most important man in America used to write. Section 8. Pascal's. The fried chicken recipe was never written down. which was a decision rather than an oversight. Robert Paschal developed it at 831 West Hunter Street in Atlanta beginning in 1947, and he protected it with the same seriousness that a man protects something he understands to be both his livelihood and his identity, which meant he kept it entirely inside his own hands and never transferred it to paper where it could be found or taken or reproduced without him. People who ate at Paschal's for decades and came back specifically for the chicken described it in the way people describe food that resists description, as something that had been seasoned beyond what any single ingredient could explain, a crust that held without being thick, meat that stayed juicy through conditions that should have dried it out. Culinary writers who tried to characterize it settled on the same word eventually, secret. That word became part of the restaurant's formal identity, Robert Paschal's secret fried chicken recipe. The secret survived him. It survived the closing. It is still secret now. James and Robert Paschal opened their first location in 1947 as a small luncheonette near the Atlanta University Center, the cluster of historically black colleges that made the surrounding neighborhood one of the most educated black communities in the American South. The proximity was not accidental. The brothers understood that an institution requires the right address, and the right address for what they were building was one surrounded by the people who would build the movement that would redefine the country over the following 2 decades. By 1959, the restaurant had moved across the street to a larger facility. By 1966, Ebony magazine was describing it as a large, attractive brick building with a soda fountain and booths in front and a large dining room in the rear. By 1967, it had added a 125-room motor hotel and a jazz lounge called La Carousel, and the whole complex had become something that Atlanta's black community understood as its own, a place that offered the full range of what a city owes its people: food and music and a bed and a room where you could sit and think and plan. The planning that happened at Paschal's through the 1950s and 1960s was not incidental to the restaurant's history. It was the restaurant's history. Martin Luther King Jr. used the booths at Paschal's for strategy sessions with the frequency of a man who had found his working environment and intended to stay in it. John Lewis, who was arrested and beaten and threatened with death so many times during the movement years that the counting becomes its own kind of testament, described Paschal's as a haven, the place he could go after all of it and sit down and be in a room that was entirely his, where the food arrived without conditions and the people around him understood without explanation what the work was costing. Andrew Young came, Julian Bond came, Jesse Jackson came, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the men and women who organized the strategy that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, came regularly to a restaurant on West Hunter Street in Atlanta and ate fried chicken and gumbo and catfish étouffée, and made the decisions that history would later credit to marches and courtrooms, the decisions that actually happened at a table. James and Robert Paschal understood what their restaurant was being used for and made a deliberate choice about it. The civil rights workers who came in without money were fed. The people who needed a place to think were given the room to think in. The brothers posted bail for activists who had been arrested. This was not philanthropy in the sense of wealthy people donating surplus resources. These were men running a restaurant on the edge of financial viability who decided that the movement required their full support and gave it regardless of the cost to themselves. John Lewis said later that Paschal's was more than a restaurant. That description comes from a man who spent his life choosing his words about what things cost and what things were worth. Aretha Franklin ate at Paschal's. Dizzy Gillespie came. Maynard Jackson, who would become Atlanta's first black mayor, came before and after the office. Vice President Al Gore came. The list eventually stretched long enough that the restaurant became a destination for people who wanted to sit in the room where the movement had organized itself, which added a layer of tourism to what had always been a neighborhood institution, and tourism changes the quality of a room in ways that are difficult to resist and impossible to stop entirely once they begin. The original Paschal's closed in 1996. The complex on West Hunter Street, which had by then been renamed Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, was sold to Clark Atlanta University for $3 million. Converted into student dormitories and conference facilities. James Paschal died in 2008. Robert died in 1997. A new Paschal's opened in the Castleberry Hill neighborhood of downtown Atlanta in 2002 and operates today, carrying the name and some of the menu forward. The booth where John Lewis recovered from beatings and planned the next action is not there. The room where the movement strategy sessions happened over plates of secret fried chicken is now a dormitory. The address is a university building. The secret recipe is still secret. That much survived. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Paschal sold the address that built it and kept the name moving into a different building, which is one version of survival. The next restaurant on this list took a different approach entirely, and simply stayed in the same room for 66 years, until the neighborhood it had always fed was no longer the neighborhood it had started in. Section 9. This is it. Soul food. The steam tables were loaded before the first customer walked through the door, which meant the work had started hours earlier, in the particular darkness of a commercial kitchen preparing for a day that would not slow down until the last plate went out. What came out of those pans when the doors opened was not a restaurant's approximation of something. It was the real version, the collard greens that had been going since before you woke up, the oxtails built from a braise that started the previous afternoon, the macaroni and cheese that held its crust through the lunch rush and through the dinner rush, and was still right at the end, because someone in that kitchen understood the difference between a dish that is done and a dish that is right. The steam table is the particular instrument of a kitchen that intends to feed a neighborhood rather than impress a critic, and the kitchen at 2712 Blodgett Street in Houston's 3rd Ward ran steam tables for 66 years without apology and without modification, because 66 years of a neighborhood coming through your door is its own argument that you have been doing something correctly. Frank Jones opened the restaurant in 1959 in Houston's 4th Ward, in Freedmanstown, the neighborhood established by formerly enslaved people after emancipation, and named for the freedom that produced it. The specific address was a frame house. The specific decision to open a restaurant grew out of a specific family history that ran back further than 1959, back to Frank Jones's mother, who ran a boarding house in the 4th Ward in the 1920s and 1930s where she fed the people who passed through. Among the people who passed through were Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway, jazz musicians on the circuit that moved through black communities across the South before the infrastructure of mainstream American entertainment decided it was willing to accommodate them. Those men ate from the same family's kitchen that would eventually produce This Is It, which is not a piece of marketing but a fact about where certain things come from and what they carry forward across generations. The restaurant moved from the 4th Ward to the 3rd Ward over the decades, settling at Blodgett Street and becoming the kind of address that a Houston neighborhood builds its rhythms around, without quite acknowledging that it is doing so. You went there after church. You went there on the particular Saturdays when the family was large enough to need a table nobody's house could accommodate. The steam table meant you could see exactly what was available before you committed to it, which sounds like a minor feature and is actually the thing that makes a certain kind of restaurant work, the transparency of it, the way the food is visible and present and real before any transaction has occurred. What you saw at Blodgett Street was what you got. The fried chicken had the color that fried chicken has when someone monitored the oil temperature and pulled each piece at the right moment. The candied yams had the glaze that takes time to build and cannot be approximated with any shortcut that saves the minutes the glaze requires. Beyoncé grew up in Houston and came to This Is It during the years when Destiny's Child was becoming what it became, which is to say, during the years when she and Kelly Rowland were young women in a city that was becoming too large for them and not large enough at the same time. Rowland returned decades later and made the restaurant part of a Pepsi campaign organized around local establishments that had fed her and shaped her, which is a formal version of something people do informally all the time, which is point at a place and say, that one. That is where something real happened. That is where I understood something I did not understand before I sat down. Former First Lady Jill Biden visited in August 2024, and the visit was noted the way visits to certain restaurants are noted. Not because a famous person eating somewhere makes the food better, but because it confirms something the neighborhood already knew, which is that the address had meaning beyond the block. Craig Joseph Sr. was the 3rd generation of his family to run the restaurant, the grandson of Frank and Mattie Jones, and he ran it with his children alongside him, making it 4 generations of the same family in the same kitchen and in the same relationship with the same neighborhood. That arithmetic does something to a restaurant that nothing else can replicate. Because what 4 generations produces is not just consistency of food, but consistency of understanding. The knowledge that passes from one set of hands to the next, not as a recipe, but as a sensibility. The sense of what the neighborhood needs on a given day, and what it needed on the same day a decade ago, and 2 decades ago, and how those needs have shifted, and how they have remained the same. The 3rd Ward location closed on October 12, 2025. The family said in the statement they sent to the city that the memories of shared meals and celebrations were what they were carrying forward. Gentrification had been remaking the 3rd Ward for years by the time the doors closed. The same process that had displaced black communities from their anchoring institutions in Oakland, and in Chicago's South Side, and in every other city where the value of the land eventually outpaced the ability of the people who had always been on it to stay. The humble location remained open. Another door opened on Blodgett under different ownership. The steam tables that had been loaded before dawn for 66 years at that address are loaded somewhere else now, or they are not loaded at all. This is it, closed in the 3rd Ward after 66 years and 4 generations, and the neighborhood that built it kept going around the absence. But the next restaurant on this list did not close because the neighborhood changed around it. It closed because the city came and took the land and put something else on top of it, and what it put there is still standing today. Section 10. Dorsey's Locker. The men and women who came to Oakland from Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi and Arkansas during the Second World War came specifically because the shipyards needed labor and were willing, in ways the South had not been and would not be for decades, to pay black workers the same wage as anyone else. They came by the tens of thousands and they settled in West Oakland, and they built what people build when they arrive somewhere with the intention of staying, which is the full version of a community, churches and newspapers and social clubs and a music corridor that eventually earned the neighborhood a name it has carried ever since. The Harlem of the West Coast was what people called it, because 7th Street in its prime was what 125th Street in New York had been in an earlier generation, the full musical life of a community compressed into a corridor, clubs running one after another where musicians played all night and then needed somewhere to go when the lights came down. Henry and Wilma Dorsey arrived in that West Oakland and opened Mother's Cafe in 1941 at 7th and Magnolia, a small place that served food to workers who had come from the same southern states the Dorseys had, and who understood without explanation what Texas-style soul food meant, and why it was what you ate at the end of a shift or after a set. Short ribs of beef, smothered chicken, oxtails built from a braise that required the morning to produce what the evening needed, gumbo, catfish and red snapper done the way Southern cooks do them, not as a delicacy but as a staple, the thing that goes into the pan without ceremony and comes out as something you would cross a neighborhood to eat again. By 1956, the restaurant had moved to 5817 Shattuck Avenue in North Oakland and taken a new name, Dorsey's Bosun Locker, the bosun a reference to Henry Dorsey's Navy service, a boatswain being the officer who holds the deck together. The name was accurate. What Dorseys did in North Oakland for the next 60 years was hold a structure together, the particular structure of a black community in a city that was changing faster than its institutions could accommodate. The food stayed the same through those changes. The Texas-style preparations that had been the point from the beginning remained the point, still built the same way, still requiring the patience that the best food in that tradition always requires. The musicians who had filled 7th Street came to Dorsey's. Eli's Mile High Club down on 7th had been the place where James Brown and Etta James and Sugar Pie DeSanto would stop after their own gigs to play for a room full of musicians who understood what they were hearing in a way regular audiences could not. That circuit of music and food and late hours was what West Oakland ran on, and Dorsey's was part of it the way a kitchen is always part of any world that requires people to work hard and eat correctly. You came in after the music because you had used everything the music took from you, and the oxtails at Dorsey's were exactly what the body asked for when it had given everything it had. What changed in North Oakland over the decades was not what was coming out of the kitchen at Shattuck. What changed was who was paying the rent on the buildings around it. The process that observers were calling gentrification by the late 1990s had moved far enough north by 2015 that the real estate values around Shattuck Avenue had stopped reflecting the community that had always lived there and started reflecting the community arriving to replace it. When Dorsey's announced it was closing in the summer of 2015 and Art's Crab Shack on Broadway, a North Oakland institution since the 1960s, announced its own closing the same month, someone wrote on the internet that North Oakland gentrification was officially complete. The observation required no elaboration. What had fed the black community in that neighborhood for 3 generations had been priced out of the neighborhood that community had built, and everyone who was paying attention understood what that meant. What replaced Dorsey's at 5817 Shattuck was a new restaurant opened by new owners for a different clientele, operating in the same room that had smelled like Texas-style soul food since 1956. The building is still there. The new restaurant is in it. What it serves is not oxtails. The following June, a 3rd restaurant closed. Nellie Ozen, founder of Nellie's Soul Food on 3rd Street in West Oakland, was in her 80s and still rising at 4 in the morning to cook when the building was sold in 2016. 3 black-owned soul food restaurants with more than a century and a half of combined history between them, gone from Oakland inside 13 months. The corridor that had been the Harlem of the West Coast kept moving without them, which is what corridors do, because they have no memory that does not travel with a person. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dorsey's Locker closed, and the room it had occupied for 60 years became something else before that summer ended. But the next restaurant on this list closed because the woman who had always made it work died, and then the city honored her name, and then the building came down anyway, and now the block has no record of what stood there. Section 11. H&H Restaurant. There was a day in the early 1970s when a group of young musicians who had come to Macon, Georgia because the record label that wanted them was there, sat down at a table on Cotton Avenue and pooled their money and discovered they had enough for 2 meals between all of them. They were hungry in the particular way that people are hungry when they are doing work they believe in and have not yet been paid fairly for it, and they sat with 2 plates in the middle of the table and ate what they could reach across. Louise Hudson was watching from behind the counter. She looked at them, at the particular thinness of young men who have been eating on nothing for months, and she brought each of them their own plate and told them to pay when they had the money. They had the money eventually, considerably more than they had started with, and they came back. The Allman Brothers Band became one of the most successful rock acts in American history, and they never forgot the woman on Cotton Avenue who had looked at them and made a decision about what they needed before they could ask. Louise Hudson, who everyone called Mama Louise, rode the Allman Brothers tour bus in 1972 because the friendship between a soul food cook and a southern rock band was real enough to travel. An original H&H table is displayed today at the Allman Brothers Band Museum at the Big House in Macon. Greg Allman was at Mama Louise's birthday celebration in 2007, held at the Macon Armory Ballroom, where a congressional citation was read, and the city of Macon declared July 26 Mama Louise Day and presented her with a brick placed in the Georgia Music Hall of Fame walkway. The brick calls her the mother of Southern rock. That description is not sentiment. It is documentation of a specific relationship between a specific kitchen and a specific history that grew from it. Inez Hill, who everyone called Mama Hill, opened the restaurant in 1959 with her goddaughter and cousin Louise Hudson, starting at a location on Hayes and 3rd Street before moving to Cotton Avenue and eventually settling at 807 Forsyth Street in downtown Macon. The building that became H&H's permanent home had been a former filling station, which is the kind of origin story a restaurant earns when it is not waiting for ideal conditions before deciding to exist. Macon in 1959 was a legally segregated city, and a black-owned restaurant in downtown meant a room that served a community not permitted to sit at most of the other tables in the city. The proximity of H&H to the barbershops and hair salons and law offices and dentist offices of the black professional corridor meant that the people who ran the neighborhood's economy could walk from their doors to a kitchen that understood what they needed without requiring them to explain it. What made H&H specific was the meat in 3 structure, the daily rotation that told you what was available before you sat down and asked nothing of you except that you choose. Monday brought collards, macaroni and cheese, lima beans, okra, rice, and squash. Thursday brought collards, corn, boiled okra, rice, snap beans, and black-eyed peas. The rotation held across decades because a kitchen with a rotation has made a commitment, and a commitment made in a public kitchen is a commitment made to the neighborhood that eats from it. The fried chicken was made to order rather than held in a steam table, which in a lunch counter format requires the kind of timing and attention that most kitchens find impractical, and that H&H maintained, because the chicken done correctly was the entire argument for the address. H&H was one of the first restaurants in Macon to desegregate during the civil rights movement, which meant it was among the first rooms in the city where black and white customers sat at adjacent tables without the arrangement being contested. Civil rights activists used it for meetings. NOC officers came through. Georgia state politicians came because the food was worth the trip, and because being seen in that room meant something specific about what kind of Georgia politician you intended to be. The Allman Brothers, who were partially integrated at a time when that was not a safe position in the South, found their way to a restaurant that had already decided integration was the correct answer before the law required it. That alignment was not coincidental. It was what a room becomes when the person running it has made certain decisions about who belongs inside it. Mama Hill died in the years before 2013, and H&H closed that year. The Moonhanger Group, a Macon restaurant company, reopened it in 2014 in cooperation with Mama Louise, who came by to make certain the recipes were being respected, which is what founders do when a place means enough that retirement cannot be complete. New chefs came in and the menu continued and the walls kept their photographs, and the building on Forsyth Street kept its name. What it no longer had was the particular combination of 2 women who had opened it together in a segregated city and run it together long enough that the city eventually named a day after one of them. That particular combination existed once and produced what it produced, and what the Moonhanger Group runs on Forsyth Street carries the history forward without being able to replicate the origin. Mama Louise died on July 5, 2015, a year after the reopening. Greg Allman died in 2017. The table they shared in the early years of the 1970s is in a museum. The The brick is in the Hall of Fame walkway. The building is still on Forsyth Street with the name on it and food coming out of the kitchen, which is one version of what survival looks like when the people who made something are gone. The building on Forsyth Street kept the name going after the women who built it were gone from it. But the next restaurant on this list did not close because a founder died or because a neighborhood shifted. It closed because the family running it spent years dismantling what the name stood for, and the federal government came to finish the job. Section 12, Gladys Knight's Chicken and Waffles. The menu item was called the Midnight Train, and if you ordered it, you received southern fried jumbo chicken wings alongside a waffle, the name borrowed from the song that had made Gladys Knight's voice one of the most recognized voices in American popular music since 1973. The naming of a dish after a hit record is the particular language of a restaurant that wants you to understand what kind of room you are in before the food reaches your table, a place where the celebrity name above the door and the thing on the plate are intended to feel like expressions of the same thing. At its best, in the years when the kitchen was running correctly and the name meant what it was supposed to mean, that feeling held. You ordered the Midnight Train or the item that carried some other piece of the night catalog in its name, and the food justified the reference, and the room justified the address, and the address justified the name. Shanga Hankerson opened the first location in 1997 at 618 Ponce de Leon Avenue in Midtown Atlanta. Gladys Knight is his mother, and she entered into an agreement that year allowing him to use her name and likeness in the restaurant in exchange for monthly royalties, described later in court documents as similar to a celebrity endorsement. The opening drew Atlanta Mayor Bill Campbell and a pair of R&B stars whose presence signaled that this was not a quiet neighborhood opening, but an event, the kind of debut that puts a restaurant into a city's cultural conversation before a single review has been written. The kitchen served Southern fare, built around fried chicken and waffles, a combination whose Harlem origins had by 1997 been sufficiently absorbed into the broader culture that a restaurant in Atlanta could claim it as a natural menu anchor without anyone requiring explanation. The restaurant worked for a long time. 2 additional locations opened across the Atlanta metro area as the first location drew crowds consistent enough to justify expansion, and for nearly 2 decades the name on the door carried the weight a name needs to carry to sustain 3 separate kitchens in a competitive market. Tourists came because the name was recognizable. Locals came because the food at its best was worth returning to. The combination of those 2 things, the recognition and the quality, is what a celebrity restaurant requires to outlast the novelty of its opening, and for most of its run, Gladys Knight's Chicken and Waffles cleared that requirement. What began coming apart in 2016 was not the food, and not the concept, and not the name itself, but the management of the money the name had generated. The Georgia Department of Revenue executed search warrants at all 3 locations and at the corporate headquarters in June 2016, after investigators concluded that Hankerson had diverted more than $650,000 in state sales tax, a figure that exceeded $1 million once penalties and interest were applied. Hankerson was arrested on 2 felony counts of theft by taking and released on a $20,000 bond. The restaurants were forced to close during the raid and were subsequently operated under state receivership before partial reopening. In February of the same year, the Peachtree Street location had failed a health inspection with a score of 56 after inspectors found 15 violations, a number high enough that the score stood on its own as an argument about what was happening inside that kitchen. Gladys Knight filed suit in August 2016 demanding that Hankerson stop using her name and likeness in the restaurants, citing declining revenues and his legal troubles as having caused material damage to her reputation. Her lawsuit alleged mismanagement. Hankerson's legal response claimed his mother did not have the capacity to terminate their agreement. The argument between them was conducted in court documents while the restaurants continued operating in reduced form, the name above the door becoming the primary object of a family dispute conducted in public, which is a particular kind of visibility that no food can compete with, and no kitchen can recover from while it is ongoing. Knight formally ended the naming agreement, and the Peachtree Street location was eventually renamed World Famous Chicken and Waffles, though most people who passed it continued to call it Gladys Knight's, because a name applied to an address for nearly 2 decades does not disappear when the signage changes. The health inspections continued to find problems. The tax obligations continued to be unmet. The Lithonia location closed without reopening. The other locations followed. By the time the last of them had shut, the restaurant that had opened with a mayor and R&B stars in 1997 had spent its final years as the subject of arrest warrants and receiverships and court filings, which is the distance between what a name promises and what a kitchen requires to make good on it. Hankerson was convicted and sentenced to prison in 2021, and ordered to pay restitution exceeding $1 million. An IRS official said in a public statement at sentencing that paying taxes is a way to give back to the community, and that Hankerson had chosen to use those funds for other means. The people who had lined up outside the Ponce de Leon location in 1997 to be in the room on the first night were not asked what they thought about that. The midnight train is not on any menu anymore. The name is gone from the signs. The kitchens are dark. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gladys Knight's Chicken and Waffles ended in courtrooms and closed kitchens, which is one version of how a restaurant dies. The next place on this list closed in a city that had been taking things from it for decades before anyone used that word for what was happening, and what it served in those years was not just food, but the particular piece of a room where the movement could breathe. Section 13, Wash's Restaurant. The 6 a.m. show at Club Harlem ended, and the crowd came out onto Kentucky Avenue in the way a crowd exits a room where something good has just finished, not quite ready for the walk home, still carrying the heat of what had happened inside. In Atlantic City in the 1940s and 1950s, that hour between 5 and 7 in the morning was not an ending so much as a seam, the place where one version of the day gave way to the next, and on Kentucky Avenue, the question of what you ate at that hour had a specific answer. You walked a few doors down to 35 North Kentucky Avenue, which meant you had 20 seats to choose from, and a kitchen that Clifton and Alma Washington had opened in 1937, and that already knew what you needed before you finished sitting down. The sausage sandwiches were what the kitchen was known for, not the elaborate long-simmered preparation that other traditions centered, but the immediate thing, the filling thing, the right answer to the particular hunger of a person who had been awake and working since before you went to sleep. You ordered, and the kitchen moved, and the food arrived, and the hour organized itself around what you were eating, which is what a correct meal does at any hour, but especially at 6 in the morning after a night of being somewhere that required everything you had. Club Harlem was the anchor of the Kentucky Avenue corridor, a venue that at its peak held more than 1,000 people for a show and regularly did, and the names who performed there ran the full length of what American popular music meant in the middle of the 20th century. Billie Holiday came, Ella Fitzgerald came, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Sammy Davis Jr., Sarah Vaughan, Nat King Cole. These were not performers passing through a minor venue on the edge of a circuit that mattered somewhere else. These were the people who defined what American music was, during the years when that definition was being settled, and they performed in Atlantic City's Black Entertainment District, because the geography of segregation had organized where black performers could sleep and eat and be treated like human beings after doing the work that made them famous. In the Boardwalk hotels 2 blocks east, some of them performed for white audiences, none of them checked in as guests. On Kentucky Avenue, you were in a room where the arithmetic was different, where who you were and what you had just performed meant something other than what it meant when you tried to walk through a different door 2 blocks away. What the Washingtons understood was that the corridor's schedule was the kitchen schedule, and the corridor ran all night. The black hotel workers who made the beds and ran the service operations in the Boardwalk hotels finished their shifts in the early morning hours and came to Kentucky Avenue on their way home, the same avenue the performers were coming to from the opposite direction. You might be sitting next to Billie Holiday, or you might be sitting next to a housekeeper who had been working since midnight. The 20 seats distributed the room without consulting anyone's preferences about who belonged next to who, and that distribution was its own form of dignity, the version a small room produces when it has enough food for everyone who walks through the door. By the 1950s, the operation had moved to 1702 Arctic Avenue and expanded to more than 100 seats under the name Wash & Sons Seafood Restaurant, the menu growing to include barbecued ribs and fried chicken alongside the seafood that Atlantic City's position on the coast made available. The same populations filled the larger room that had filled the 20 seats, workers and performers and the regular people of a neighborhood that had built a complete economy inside the one the Boardwalk excluded them from. What that neighborhood had built was not a compromise or a second version of what existed elsewhere. It was the full version, its own insurance companies and newspapers and hotels and music venues and restaurants, the infrastructure of a community that had decided to build what it needed rather than wait for what it was being denied. What began reducing that infrastructure was a process that did not have a widely understood name yet, though it had been working through black urban neighborhoods across the country since the end of the Second World War. In Atlantic City, it arrived in 2 sustained movements. The first was the urban renewal programs of the late 1950s and 1960s that cleared portions of black neighborhoods for development that did not serve the people being displaced. The second was the 1976 legalization of casino gambling in New Jersey. The first casino opened on the Boardwalk in 1978, and what followed was the systematic transformation of a declining resort city into a gambling destination that required land and a reorganized labor force, and the removal of whatever had existed on the land before the construction crews arrived. The casinos of the 1980s built over what Kentucky Avenue had been, and by the time Club Harlem closed in 1986, the corridor that had held it was already becoming the past tense version of itself. Wash's restaurant closed in 2012, 75 years after Clifton and Alma Washington first opened the door at 35 North Kentucky Avenue and asked what a hungry person needed at 6 in the morning. The performers who had come off the Club Harlem stage and needed a meal had long since moved to hotels that now permitted them to check in. The boardwalk casino economy that had displaced what Kentucky Avenue had been was itself contracting by 2012, several of the casinos that had consumed the corridor beginning their own closures. 75 years is a long time to hold a room open. What the room had held across that time was not just food, but the particular version of dignity that a kitchen produces when it decides to be open for anyone who needs it at whatever hour they need it, which is the version of dignity the boardwalk 2 blocks away was not offering, and the kitchen on Kentucky Avenue always was. Wash's closed in 2012, and the avenue it had kept company with since 1937 was already something else by the time the door closed for good. But the next restaurant on this list was not taken by a city and not displaced by an industry. It ran for 50 years because of one woman who got up at 4 in the morning to cook, and it closed the week she and her daughter decided that 50 years was enough. Section 14. Nellie's Soul Food. The jukebox was still running when the last customers came in during the final weeks. That detail matters in a specific way because a jukebox in a soul food restaurant in West Oakland in 2016 is not an ambient feature or a nostalgic gesture. It is a decision about what kind of room you intend to keep, about what the room owes the people in it beyond the food, about whether the hours between sitting down and finishing your plate should contain something that works on the part of you that the smothered oxtails cannot reach. Nellie Ozen had been making both decisions simultaneously for 50 years, the decision about the food and the decision about the music, and neither one had changed in 50 years because neither one needed to. The oxtails were what smothered oxtails become when the same hands have been building the same brace since the early 1960s. The jukebox was the jukebox, the room was the room. And then on June 30th, 2016, after a farewell dinner 3 days earlier that the restaurant hosted for free with live music and a full menu, Nellie Ozen and her daughter Quinette closed the door at 1155 3rd Street in West Oakland and did not open it again. Nellie Ozen started the restaurant sometime in the 1960s, the exact year lost to the informal record-keeping that characterizes businesses opened by black women in West Oakland during that decade, businesses that were not covered by the press that covered other businesses, and that did not announce themselves to archives that would have recorded the date. What is known is that she was in her 80s when the restaurant closed, which means she had been running that kitchen since she was a woman in her 30s. Which means the range of years she spent getting up at 4 in the morning to begin the work that the lunch and dinner service required runs somewhere between 45 and 55 years, depending on which opening year is correct. At 4 in the morning, the specific year the thing started does not change what 4 in the morning requires of a body, or what a body has to decide about what it is willing to give. West Oakland was the community the restaurant lived inside and served. The neighborhood had received the families who came from Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma and Mississippi during the war years and after them, the same migration that had filled Chicago's South Side and Harlem and Detroit's Black Bottom with the people who built those communities' institutions. In West Oakland, they built the same things, churches and social organizations, and the music scene along 7th Street that had earned the neighborhood its name. What Nellie Ozen built at 3rd Street was the kind of restaurant those communities require, which is not the spectacular kind or the kind that earns press attention, but the foundational kind, the room you can walk to from your house and sit in without ceremony and eat food that tastes like someone who understood your life made it. The smothered oxtails were the dish people cited first. Smothered oxtails require the kind of patience that cannot be faked or accelerated, the collagen in the connective tissue around the bone converting to gelatin only when the heat is low enough and the time is long enough, producing a braise that thickens itself from the inside and coats the back of a spoon and coats the bottom of a bowl in a way that makes the rice underneath it into something different from plain rice. 50 years of making the same dish in the same kitchen produces a consistency that no recipe written on paper can replicate, because what the recipe cannot capture is the accumulated knowledge of how the pot sounds at the correct temperature, and how the color shifts in the final 30 minutes, and how the smell changes when the collagen has done its full work. That knowledge lived in Nellie Ozen's hands and in her daughter's, and in the particular kitchen on 3rd Street. And it left when they did. The fried chicken was there. The fried fish was there. The menu covered the range of what a West Oakland soul food kitchen owed its neighborhood, without overextending into territory that required ingredients or techniques that distracted from what the kitchen did best. What it did best was the long-cooked things, the preparations that started before the doors opened and were ready when you arrived, the food that told you someone had been thinking about your meal since before you woke up and decided you wanted it. That relationship between the cook's morning and the customer's afternoon is the specific thing a steam table and a jukebox and 50 years of the same address make possible, and it is not transferable to a different address or reproducible in a kitchen that has not been doing it long enough to understand what right smells like. The closure at 3rd Street came the same year that came after Dorsey's Locker and Art's Crab Shack had both closed in North Oakland. The 3 losses together representing more than a century and a half of black-owned food history gone from Oakland inside 13 months. The process that had been remaking the real estate market in North Oakland had reached further west and further into the city's timeline of black institutions, and what was being lost was not being replaced by anything that served the same community or filled the same role at the same hour of the morning. Nellie Ozen was in her 80s when the door closed. She had been getting up at 4 in the morning for 50 years. The decision to stop was hers to make, and she made it. And 3 days before the last service, she opened the room for free, with music and the full menu, and let the neighborhood eat one more time in the way it had always eaten there, which was together, at whatever hour it needed to, with the jukebox running. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nellie Ozen got up at 4 in the morning for 50 years, and then she stopped, and the room closed around that decision. But the next place on this list never got to make that decision for itself. What closed it was something smaller than 50 years, and more particular than a neighborhood. A pink room in Greenwich Village where the food had been right since 1954, and the rent had not been right for a decade before the door finally closed. Section 15. The Pink Teacup. The color announced itself before you finished crossing the street. That particular shade of pink, deep enough to be unmistakable and vivid enough to stop the eye at half a block, covered everything the building showed to Grove Street in Greenwich Village, and inside it covered everything the room contained. The walls and the details and the general atmosphere of a space that had made a decision about itself in 1954 and saw no reason to revisit that decision in 1965 or 1975 or any of the years between. You walked through the door and you were immediately in a room that had committed to being itself completely, without apology and without the softening gestures that rooms make when they are not entirely confident in what they are. Most restaurants in New York spend considerable energy on the visual language of being taken seriously. The Pink Teacup spent none of it. It was pink, and it had 42 seats, and it had been making fried chicken and smothered pork chops and catfish since Eisenhower was in his first term, and that record of consistency was the only argument it needed to make. Mary Ray came from Florida and opened the restaurant in 1954 in Greenwich Village, with the particular clarity of someone who understands what a neighborhood is missing and has the skills to provide it. Greenwich Village in the mid-1950s was organizing itself around the idea that you could live and work outside the categories the rest of the city was enforcing, which made it a neighborhood where a soul food restaurant run by a black woman from Florida was not merely possible but precisely right. The bohemian culture of the village was making its own argument about combination and possibility through its coffee houses and bookshops and jazz clubs, and the Pink Teacup made the same argument through fried chicken and biscuits and collard greens in a room painted the color of something that refused to be ignored. The village accepted it the way the village accepted things that were entirely themselves, which was completely. 42 seats is a room that knows its own purpose. In a room that size, the kitchen has a relationship with its customers in the way a neighborhood kitchen should. The person who ordered the smothered pork chops last Tuesday returning this Tuesday because the smothered pork chops were right last Tuesday, and the kitchen having been making them for that person long enough that the preparation has moved past recipe and past technique and into the territory where the hands know what the mind does not have to supervise. The fried chicken at the Pink Teacup earned the reputation that fried chicken earns in that way. Across years of the same kitchen making the same dish, with the same knowledge, brought north from Florida and maintained without variation through decades of a neighborhood, changing dramatically around a room that changed nothing. The sweet potatoes. The biscuits that arrived at the table while you were still finding your seat. The collard greens that carried in them the specific information of how long they had been on the heat, and what they had been cooked with, and who had been watching the pot. These were not approximations of the food they were named for. They were the thing itself, made by someone who understood the tradition completely, and had not modified it to accommodate a neighborhood that might have found it unfamiliar, because the neighborhood found it exactly familiar. Found it the thing it had been looking for in a city that offered nearly everything except this particular version of this particular comfort. Charles Ray took over the restaurant in 1979. The move to Grove Street happened in 1982, the third address in the restaurant's history and the one it would occupy until the end. In 1989, the restaurant passed to Mary Ray's niece and grandniece, Lisa Ford, becoming the third generation of the same family to run a kitchen the family had built 35 years earlier. Most restaurants in New York cannot produce a third generation because most restaurants in New York do not survive long enough for one to exist. The Pink Teacup produced a third generation and kept running. Whoopi Goldberg was a regular. Oprah Winfrey came. Liz Smith, the newspaper columnist who had been covering New York long enough to understand which details carried weight, ate there and wrote about it the way writers write about places they intend to keep, which is specifically and with the full weight of their attention. These were not the visits that a restaurant manufactures through publicists and reservation systems. They were the visits that happen when a room has been doing something correctly for long enough that the people who understand what correct means find it and stay. What the September 11 attacks did to Lower Manhattan's restaurant economy was particular and extended. The Pink Teacup absorbed the decline in the tourist traffic that Greenwich Village restaurants depended on and could not compensate for regardless of what was coming out of the kitchen. The rent on a Grove Street address continued at the rate a Grove Street address commanded in a neighborhood growing more expensive every year, which meant the gap between income and cost grew through the first decade of the new century until it could no longer be closed. Lisa Ford announced in December 2009 that the restaurant would close on January 3, 2010. She cited a weak economy and rising costs. 15 people who had worked in that kitchen lost their jobs. The announcement noted that business had been declining since the September 11th attacks 9 years earlier, which meant the restaurant had been managing the gap for nearly a decade before the gap became unmanageable. 55 years on one block in Greenwich Village is a particular kind of survival. It means outlasting bohemian Greenwich Village and activist Greenwich Village and tourist Greenwich Village and gentrifying Greenwich Village while remaining the same room in the same pink, serving the same food to whoever found the door. The room found and fed 4 generations of the neighborhood before the arithmetic stopped working. The color is gone from Grove Street. The 42 seats are occupied by something that arrived after the pink came down. The Pink Teacup held its color for 55 years on one block in Greenwich Village, and then the block changed around it for the last time. But the next restaurant on this list had no color to identify it and needed none. What identified it was smoke, and the smoke rose from an Atlanta block where the most important church in American civil rights was half a block away, and the man who preached there was also the man who sat in the back corner booth. Section 16, Auburn Avenue Rib Shack. The smoke was the address. That was how you found it if you did not already know where it was. Because Auburn Avenue in Atlanta in its prime was a commercial corridor busy enough that a sign alone could get lost in the motion of the block. But smoke rising from a building where ribs had been cooking since early morning was its own kind of marker, the kind that works on you before you have made any decision about eating, before you have quite finished deciding that you are hungry, while you are still just moving through the block doing whatever brought you to Auburn Avenue that day. By the time you had walked another half block, you had already decided, and what you had decided was that the smoke was where you were going. Fortune magazine described Auburn Avenue in 1956 as the richest Negro street in America, a characterization that carried more meaning than the economics it described. To call a segregated street the richest of its kind in the country was to describe a community that had built a complete and self-sustaining economy inside the walls that segregation drew around it, and Auburn Avenue was exactly that. Black-owned banks and insurance companies and newspapers and hotels and churches stood along its length, a concentrated demonstration of what a community builds when it is excluded from participating in the broader economy and decides to build its own. The street was known internationally. People came to see it the way people come to see things that disprove a general argument about what is possible. Ebenezer Baptist Church at 407 Auburn Avenue was where Martin Luther King Sr. preached, and where his son grew up attending services and eventually rose to co-preach. The church stood on the same block as the other institutions the street had built, which meant the men and women who organized the civil rights movement moved daily through a corridor that also contained the businesses that fed them and clothed them and kept their money and reported their news. The congregation of Ebenezer Baptist crossed the block regularly in both directions, and the men who planned what happened at Selma and Birmingham and Washington found their way to a back corner of the Rib Shack in the same way they found their way to every table on Sweet Auburn that was willing to hold them, which was without ceremony and without the particular management of dignity that other rooms required them to perform. The street gave them back the version of themselves that the rest of the city spent considerable energy refusing to acknowledge. What the Rib Shack made was not complicated in the way that complicated food is complicated. It was barbecue, which in Atlanta in that era meant smoked meat built from thyme and hardwood, and a sauce formula that belonged to whoever had developed it, and not to any general category. The ribs were the reason people found the address and the reason they came back, the particular quality of smoked pork that has been on the correct heat long enough that the meat has begun to draw back from the bone before anyone has touched it. A visual signal that means the cook knew what they were doing and allowed the heat the time it required to do it. The smoke that rose from the building was not incidental. It was the result of a decision made early in the morning about what the block was going to smell like by noon, and by noon the block smelled like this, and you did not need a sign. What Auburn Avenue meant to Black Atlanta was what a street means when it is the place where the full version of a life is possible, where the bank will give you a loan and the newspaper will cover your story, and the church will hold your community, and the restaurant will feed you without requiring you to enter through a different door or sit in a designated section. That version of freedom is what Sweet Auburn provided, and the restaurants and food establishments of the avenue were part of its structure in the same way the banks and newspapers were, institutions that made the community self-sustaining rather than dependent on the goodwill of people who had demonstrated they were not reliable providers of it. The avenue changed after the Civil Rights Act removed the legal framework that had made it necessary. Integration opened the doors of establishments that had previously been closed, which meant the businesses of Auburn Avenue faced competition they had not faced before. The insurance companies and banks and commercial establishments that had thrived because black customers had no other viable option found themselves competing in a market that was suddenly much larger. Some survived, many did not. The corridor that Fortune had described in its 1956 characterization was being described by the 1970s and 1980s in very different terms. As a neighborhood struggling with exactly the consequences that nobody had fully accounted for when the argument for integration was being made, which was that the end of legal exclusion would also mean the end of the captive economy that exclusion had produced. The Rib Shack ran through those decades and ran until 1999. The neon sign that identified the building was the kind of handcrafted commercial signage that nobody makes anymore, the kind that required a specific tradesman and a specific skill, and produced something that was simultaneously advertisement and art. And the Atlanta History Center recognized this when the restaurant closed and preserved the sign before it could be lost. The sign is in the museum now. What it identified is not generating smoke anymore. The block that held it is a different block from the one that Fortune described, and the difference is not only about what the businesses were, or who owned them, but about what the street permitted to exist within itself, which was the full version of a community's life compressed into a corridor. You could walk down Auburn Avenue in 1965 and buy insurance and deposit money and read news and eat ribs and attend church, and feel the particular quality of a street where everything needed was already there. That version of Auburn Avenue sustained itself for decades on exactly those things, and when one of them went, the others felt the absence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The smoke from Auburn Avenue is gone, and the neon sign is in a museum, but the next restaurant on this list made no smoke and served no meat, and it lasted 47 years on a different Atlanta block by making an argument that almost nobody was making in 1979, and it closed 3 weeks ago. Section 17. Sole Vegetarian. The newspapers were still across the windows when the founding members of the African Hebrew Israelite Nation of Jerusalem looked at the empty building on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard in Atlanta's West End in 1982 and decided this was where the restaurant was going. Not a restaurant in the sense that anyone passing the building would have recognized immediately, because the West End corridor in 1982 had little commercial development and few anchoring businesses, and no particular reason to expect that a storefront with newspapers in its windows was about to become something people would be eating in for the next 47 years. What the founding members brought to that building was not capital and not a track record and not a marketing strategy. What they brought was a commitment that preceded the restaurant and would have existed whether the restaurant did or not, rooted in the teachings of the African Hebrew Israelite community they belonged to, which held that what you ate and how you lived were not separate questions and never had been. They had opened first in 1979 at 625 Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta before the West End relocation. The word vegan was not in the general American vocabulary then in any meaningful sense. Vegetarianism existed as a concept but carried associations in the mainstream culture that had nothing to do with what was being built on Peachtree Street, which was a kitchen organized around the belief that black communities deserved access to food that helped them live longer, that the diet most accessible to poor black Americans in the South was actively working against them, and that somebody needed to demonstrate what food made according to different principles could taste like when it was made with full commitment. You were not going to find an argument for it at any other restaurant on that block. You had to walk through this door to understand that the argument was worth making. What came out of that kitchen was not the cuisine of deprivation, and that was the first thing you discovered when someone who had eaten there brought you in and told you to try it before you decided you knew what it was. The macaroni and cheese was made without dairy and tasted like macaroni and cheese, which is the specific challenge that plant-based cooking faces when it is trying to feed people who grew up with the original and carry a clear memory of what right tastes like. The candied yams were candied yams. The collard greens were collard greens. Chef Parusha Israel's barbecue kale bone was a dish she developed herself, a preparation that answered the question of what you do with a vegetable when you apply the logic of long, slow smoke and you know what you are doing with it, which she did. What the kitchen accomplished over 47 years was not substitution. It was the arrival at something that asked the same questions the original asked and answered them on its own terms. Israel had been cooking at the restaurant since 1987. The knowledge she brought to that kitchen a generational thing, transmitted through her mother who had cooked at vegan restaurants in Israel before her, the same tradition being maintained across 2 continents and across the particular span of years that turns a technique into something the hands know without consulting anything else. Saint Michael, one of the founding members who had since returned to live in the Hebrew Israelite community in Israel, described the restaurant's purpose plainly during its final weeks. They had been taught to serve and to give, and so that was what they had done, and whoever caught on took it further. People caught on in ways that extended past the neighborhood. India Ari came, and people who had been sitting at their usual tables remembered the particular quality of being in the same room as someone whose music had meant something to them while both of them were simply eating. Dr. Sebi, the Honduran herbalist whose work on plant-based medicine had developed a following in black communities across the country, spoke inside those walls. A woman who first walked down from Spelman College in 1993 as a student, 15 minutes on foot to Ralph David Abernathy for a meal she returned to every week for the next 4 years, came back during the final days of the restaurant's life and understood what the walk had always been toward. 2 generations of that relationship had been made possible by a kitchen that was open on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard, long before either generation had been born. The building's infrastructure was aging in ways that had become structural rather than manageable. The operating costs were what operating costs become in a city whose real estate economy had transformed beyond recognition from the West End of 1982. The restaurant announced in June 2026 that it would close on July 12. Israel called it a conclusion and a completion rather than a loss, which is the language of someone who has done a thing fully and is at peace with the doing having ended, not the language of someone who wanted to stop. 47 years on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard is not a failure. It is the answer to the question of what a kitchen built on conviction rather than trend is capable of sustaining. A second Atlanta location at 652 North Highland Avenue remained open when the West End doors closed on July 12, 2026. The sole vegetarian locations in Chicago continued. What closed was the specific room where the newspapers had been across the windows 44 years earlier, where the argument had first been made in that neighborhood that what you ate and how long you lived were related, and where 4.5 decades of people had walked in, uncertain, and walked out understanding something they had not understood before they sat down. The West End room closed 3 weeks ago, and Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard kept going past it. But the next restaurant on this list did not close because a building aged or because a neighborhood changed its character. It closed because the man who understood it completely was gone, and the city eventually named the street for the movement he had helped feed, and what had stood at that address became a parking lot. Section 18, Fair Deal Cafe. The conversations at the counter happened before the coffee was finished, which is the particular quality of a room that a community has decided to conduct its business in before the rest of the day requires everyone to be somewhere else. North 24th Street in Omaha, Nebraska, ran through the heart of what Black Omaha had built for itself across the first half of the 20th century, a commercial corridor that held everything the broader city had declined to provide and the community had built in the absence of that provision. Banks that would lend to black customers, insurance companies, newspapers that covered the neighborhood the daily papers did not cover, barbershops and beauty salons and music venues and the churches that held all of it together on Sunday mornings. And at 24th and Burdett, a cafe that had been open since 1954 and that the people of North Omaha had given a name that described exactly what the room was for. They called it the Black City Hall. That was not an official designation, and nobody needed it to be. It was the name that emerges organically when a room has been the place where decisions get made for long enough that everyone understands without being told. A city hall is where governance happens, where the people with the ability to affect your circumstances and the people whose circumstances need affecting find themselves in the same building at the same time, sometimes by design, and sometimes simply because that is what the morning does when a community has decided on a specific address for its most important conversations. The Fair Deal Cafe at 2118 North 24th Street was that address for nearly 50 years. Aldermen came, ministers came, the lawyers who navigated the legal structures that Black Omaha encountered daily came. The people who needed access to those aldermen and ministers and lawyers came. They sat at the same counter and ate the same food, and the proximity did the work that proximity does when a room allows it to happen without requiring anything from anyone beyond the price of a meal. The cafe opened in 1954, which placed it inside the particular moment in Black American urban history when the commercial corridors that communities had built during the Great Migration years were at or near their peak, and beginning the long negotiation with forces that would eventually reduce them. North 24th Street in 1954 was the fullest version of itself, the version that a community produces when it has had a generation to build what it needs and the generation has done the building. The cafe settled into that street and became part of its structure in the way that essential places become structural, which is by being open and being right for long enough that the people around them begin to organize their days in relation to them. What the counter at Fair Deal held across its nearly 50 years was not only food, though the food was why you first walked through the door and why you kept coming back. The food at a cafe operating on the primary commercial corridor of a Black community in the Midwest in 1954 was the food that had traveled from the South with the families who had traveled from the South, the same journey the food on Chicago's South Side had made, and the same journey the food in Detroit's Black Bottom had made, the recipes that came north in the same cars and trains as the people who carried them. You did not eat at the Fair Deal Cafe and find yourself eating something that required explanation or translation. You ate and you recognized it, and what you recognized was home stated plainly without ceremony, which is the only way it should be stated. The room where the conversations happened was the room where the community's negotiations with power were conducted, which in any American city in the second half of the 20th century meant a full range of negotiations, the ones about housing and employment and schools, and about the way the city administered its services to neighborhoods that did not always receive them equally. The people who could influence those outcomes sat at the counter of the Fair Deal Cafe in the mornings, and the people who needed those outcomes to change sat alongside them, and the room made no distinction between them because the counter and the food made no distinction. That physical proximity, the inability to pretend the person next to you does not exist when you are both eating the same meal at the same counter, is what certain rooms produce and what no policy or program can manufacture. North 24th Street began changing in the 1970s in ways that had been visible in Black commercial corridors across the Midwest since the late 1950s. Urban renewal programs displaced communities from the land their institutions occupied. Highway construction in many Midwestern cities cut through or adjacent to Black neighborhoods, physically dividing what had been continuous. The residents and businesses that could relocate did. The ones that could not remained on corridors that were losing the density that had made them viable. The Fair Deal Cafe remained. It held the counter open at 24th and Burdett, while the block around it changed and while North 24th Street became a different version of what it had been in 1954, not the peak version but the version that survives beyond the peak, still there, still organizing something, still providing the room where certain conversations could happen without requiring anyone to go somewhere less familiar. The cafe closed in 2003, 49 years after it opened, which meant it outlasted most of the other institutions that had made North 24th Street what it was in its prime. 49 years is enough time to feed 3 generations of the same family at the same counter, and in a community that organized its mornings around one address for that long, the closing of the address reorganizes everything that was organized around it. The counter at 24th and Burdett is not there. The conversations that happened there moved wherever conversations move when the room they happened in is gone, which is to say, they moved inside people and stayed there, which is a different kind of record than the kind a building keeps. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Fair Deal Cafe held 50 years of mornings on North 24th Street and then it was gone, and the mornings kept coming anyway. But the next place on this list held a different kind of conversation, not at a counter but at a crab table in North Oakland, and it held it for 50 years until the neighborhood around it was sold to someone who had no use for what it had always been. Section 19. Art's Crab Shack. Eating crab correctly requires the full commitment of both hands, and a room that serves crab correctly is a room that understands what that commitment means, and builds itself around it. The newspaper on the table is not incidental. The wooden mallets and the picks and the stack of napkins that will not be enough regardless of how many you start with are not incidental. The absence of anything on the table that requires delicacy or careful management is not incidental. A crab table is a table organized around the fact that what you are about to do will take time and will get on you and will require your complete attention. And a room that is honest about that from the moment you sit down is a room that has made a decision about what kind of honesty it intends to offer. Art's Crab Shack at 4301 Broadway in North Oakland had been making that offer since the 1960s, which means it had been making it longer than most of the people who ate there had been alive, and it had been making it to the same community across the full range of what that community had been through, which was considerable. Broadway in North Oakland was not Broadway in the sense of a theatrical address or a boulevard built for spectacle. It was a working street, the kind of commercial artery that a community uses rather than performs on, lined with the businesses that fill daily needs and accumulate history quietly, without announcing that the accumulation is happening. A crab shack on a street like that does not require a sign that explains its significance. Its significance is its presence across the decades, its reliability, the fact that when you are trying to describe where something is to someone who does not know the neighborhood, you say near Arts, because near Arts is a location that has meant something specific on that block for 50 years. What you ate at Arts was the food of a coastline carried inland by people who had grown up near that coastline and were not willing to give up the specific pleasures it produced. The East Bay's proximity to the water made crab and seafood available in a way that Midwest soul food cities could not replicate, and what Black Oakland did with that proximity was build a seafood tradition alongside the soul food tradition, the two coexisting in restaurants that understood that fried fish and crab and the preparations that came from the coastal South were as much a part of the table as the collard greens and the oxtails. Arts held both. The crab was the anchor, the reason people drove from other parts of the bay to 4301 Broadway, and sat down and committed their hands to the work that crab requires. The rest of the menu was what you ordered when you had finished with the crab and discovered you were still hungry, which happened often, because crab is work, and work is appetite. The community that came to Arts across 5 decades was the community that the Great Migration had built in West Oakland and North Oakland across the 1940s and 1950s. The same families whose names were on the membership rolls of the churches along the nearby blocks, whose children had gone to the schools in the neighborhood, whose grandchildren were now bringing their own children to a crab table they remembered from childhood, with the particular clarity that food produces when it is connected to a specific place and a specific time of life. 3 generations at the same restaurant on the same street is not a marketing story. It is a social fact, the evidence of a room that was doing something right for long enough that the rightness became structural. The month of May 2015 was when Art's Crab Shack closed at 4301 Broadway. The East Bay Express noted at the time that there were not many restaurants in Oakland with a bigger legacy, which is the kind of understatement that local journalism produces when a community loses something and the language available for loss is not equal to the scale of what went. The same article noted that Dorsey's Locker on Shattuck Avenue, a North Oakland soul food institution founded in 1941, was also closing that month. 74 years of Texas-style soul food ending at the same moment that 50 years of crab on Broadway were ending, and that someone observed online in the immediate aftermath that North Oakland gentrification was officially complete. The observation required no supporting argument. It stated what the simultaneous closures of Arts and Dorsey's had already stated, which was that the community those restaurants had served for a combined total of more than a century could no longer be found in the real estate values of the neighborhood those restaurants occupied. What replaced Arts at 4301 Broadway was a new restaurant opened by new owners for a different clientele, serving a menu that bore no relationship to what had been prepared in that kitchen for 5 decades. The crab was not on the new menu. The community that had built its meals around the crab table at Arts was not the community being invited to the new table. That is the particular cruelty of what displacement looks like from the inside of a restaurant, not the visible rupture of a demolition, but the quiet substitution of one room for another in the same building, the address remaining constant, while everything the address had meant was removed from it and replaced with something oriented toward a different set of people making different amounts of money. Broadway kept running north and south past 4301, the way it always had, carrying whoever was now on the block toward wherever the block was going, which was somewhere the Crab Shack was not included in the directions. The final restaurant on this list opened on that same street 14 years earlier, a few miles south, built something that earned a Michelin distinction and a neighborhood's devotion simultaneously, and then discovered that neither of those things was enough to hold a room open when everything around the room had been remade for someone else. Section 20. Brown Sugar Kitchen. The biscuits came out of the oven before anyone was sitting down to eat them. That was the order of things at 2534 Mandela Parkway in West Oakland, when Tanya Holland opened Brown Sugar Kitchen in January 2008. The kitchen running on a timeline that had nothing to do with when the first customer arrived, and everything to do with what the first customer deserved when they did. The bacon cheddar scallion biscuit was the first thing you were handed, or close to it, a piece of bread that required formal culinary training and a family understanding of soul food to arrive at simultaneously, because what Holland had done was bring both things to the same dough, without either one dominating the result. She had trained at La Varenne École de Cuisine in Burgundy and worked under French chefs whose names carried weight in the culinary world. And then she had come back to California and built a breakfast and lunch menu in West Oakland that owed equal debts to both sides of what she knew. The buttermilk fried chicken came with a cornmeal waffle and apple cider syrup. That combination had existed before in various forms, but the version that came out of Holland's kitchen had something in it that the people who tasted it recognized immediately as the result of someone who had thought about every element of a simple thing until every element was exactly right. What West Oakland needed in 2008 was not another restaurant. What West Oakland needed was what it had always needed, which was a kitchen that understood the community it occupied and made food that told the people in it that the address was for them. The neighborhood that Henry and Wilma Dorsey had moved into in 1941 to open Mother's Cafe had changed in the 67 years since, but the foundational need that had justified Mother's Cafe had not changed at all. You needed a place where the food was made with full attention by someone who understood what full attention required, and where sitting down to eat it did not require you to perform a version of yourself designed for a room that had not been built with you in mind. Brown Sugar Kitchen was built with you in mind. The biscuits were evidence. The apple cider syrup was evidence. The line that formed on weekend mornings outside the Mandela Parkway storefront was evidence. People from across the Bay Area standing on a West Oakland sidewalk because what was inside was worth the waiting, in the way that things worth waiting for always are, which is to say completely and without negotiation. Chef Preeti Mistry, who understood from her own cooking what it meant to bring a tradition to a room that had not fully encountered it before, described the first time she bit into the chicken and waffles at Brown Sugar Kitchen as the moment she understood that Holland had thought about making every aspect of a simple thing so precisely right that what arrived on the plate was not merely the combination, but the best version the combination had ever been. That observation is the kind serious cooks make about other serious cooks, meaning it came from someone who understood the work involved and was not flattering the result, but describing it accurately. The way a specific kind of attention produces a specific kind of outcome that other people who pay that kind of attention can recognize without having to ask what produced it. The Michelin Guide gave Brown Sugar Kitchen a Bib Gourmand designation across multiple years, the recognition the guide provides for restaurants that deliver exceptional quality at a price that does not require exceptional income to access. The designation mattered not as a credential but as a description of what the restaurant had always been, which was serious food available to the community it lived inside. Holland appeared on Top Chef's 15th season and on a cooking series on the OWN network, and the visibility those appearances produced brought people to Mandela Parkway who might not otherwise have found it. The other thing that visibility did was confirm for the people who had already found it that what they had found was being recognized beyond the block, which is a different kind of confirmation than the one the food itself provided, but a real one. In 2019, the restaurant moved to a 4,000 square foot flagship at 2295 Broadway in Uptown Oakland, a larger and more prominent address than Mandela Parkway, the kind of move a restaurant makes when 10 years of consistent quality has produced enough momentum to justify a larger room. The new location had banquets and a full bar and the kind of visual presentation that a Broadway address invited and a Mandela Parkway storefront had not required. The food was the same. The biscuits were the same. The weekend brunch line sometimes ran for hours before the doors opened. Then the pandemic and the empty offices and the rising rent and the crime that increased when foot traffic decreased and all the interlocked pressures that 2020 and 2021 placed on restaurants operating on correct but not comfortable margins. On the day before Christmas Eve 2021, Brown Sugar Kitchen served its last meal without knowing it was the last meal because Holland and her partners had planned to close for the holidays and reopen on January 10th. In January, they decided the reopening was not going to happen. Nobody got to plan a final meal. Nobody got to come one last time knowing it was the last time. Holland said that was what made her sad. Not the closing itself, but that particular absence of a farewell. The way the room ended without the people inside it understanding it was ending. 15 years is not 65 years. It is not 75 years. What Brown Sugar Kitchen held across 15 years was a different weight than what Army and Lou's held across 65, Not the weight of generations, but the weight of a community finding itself represented in a Michelin-recognized kitchen on its own block, which is its own particular meaning. The 20 rooms on this list held everything between them, from civil rights strategy sessions to jazz musicians' late suppers, to the booth where smoked ribs fueled the speeches that changed the country. They held what a black kitchen does when it is given the time and the address and the community it needs. Dorsey's Locker was there for 74 years. Wash's for 75, Wells Supper Club for 61. The length of time was not what made them matter. What made them matter was what happened inside them, night after night and morning after morning, when the food was right and the room was full, and the address meant something specific to the people who knew where it was. When the addresses change hands, or the founders die, or the city takes the land, or the rent outpaces what any kitchen can earn from doing its work correctly, the rooms close. What was held in them does not close. It travels with everyone who was ever inside, which means it is still moving through the people who sat at those counters and ate that food and carried the memory of it into every room they have occupied since. That is simply what a kitchen leaves behind. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.